I have two roles, I guess. One is my role with the TGA, which is part of the Health Products Regulatory Group, but also I'm the chair of the HREC at the Children's Hospital. And I guess just starting very broadly, the role of the regulator is to be able to, governed by a set of legislative requirements, be able to ensure that individuals and industry comply with legislative requirements. And certainly in the therapeutics regulation, there's quite a comprehensive set of legal and legislative systems to help us authorise products for human use. This is obviously systems that operate globally, and certainly since the pandemic, we've seen quite a lot of increasing cooperation and alignment and active information sharing and pragmatic solutions and regulatory convergence. But I guess it's in the specific area that I wanted to talk about, which is authorised prescribers, where we're talking about unregulated programs. Now, just yesterday we saw the Prime Minister apologise to all of some of the sufferers that were in Parliament yesterday because of the effects of thalidomide that had been given to their mothers during gestation, that resulted in significant limb abnormalities in up to as much as 20% of women who'd been given it, and it was following that really. And if you follow the sort of the timeline down, you'll see that following McBride's publication, the Commonwealth Government first set up their registry of adverse drug events with the TGA first established with its 1990 Act and regulations. And since then, the plans to separate from the Department of Health and pair up with the New Zealand equivalent sort of started and then failed. And we've just sort of settled into our brand new buildings and purpose-built laboratories, which are out near Canberra Airport. We were established to safeguard and enhance the health of the Australian community through effective and timely regulation. We've got a national system of controls that relate to safety, quality and efficacy and timely availability. We're headquartered in Canberra with 1,000 staff, and interestingly and probably uniquely around the world, almost all of our operations are cost recovered from industry fees and charges. The Act itself was first established in 1989, and it details the requirements for listing, registering and including therapeutic goods. There's a number of regulations that sit us alongside that. But interestingly, even though the Act provides a national framework for the TGA to assess all products according to their quality, safety and efficacy, and then requires all of these things to be registered on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, there are some circumstances where individuals can request access to unapproved products through their medical practitioner. And it's the unapproved products that I guess I really wanted to talk about. Before I do that, I want to talk about medicine scheduling, which, if you like, for my very medical brain is the sort of the other law that all of the medicines at least adhere to. And it's scheduling that determines the level of public access. They're scheduled from 10 down to 2, where 10 is the most strict, where a poison that you can have absolutely no access to sits. And then in 9, where you recognise there are some drugs with problems in terms of toxicity and dependence, but is available in a clinical trial setting. The drugs that we know most about are the ones that are available on prescription and from your doctor, and they sit in Schedule 4. The reason, I guess, for this talk is that recently there was a rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin in psychedelic-assisted therapy. And that decision was quite a prolonged decision, which happened over about 2 years. And I've just listed some of the processes that we went through. But essentially, the decision that was earlier this year, the delegate decided that MDMA and psilocybin, which are psychedelics, when they're used in psychedelic-assisted therapy, could be moved from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. And it was that movement, even though they're still have not been assessed, they're not registered drugs, that opened up the need for these drugs to be accessed through an unapproved pathway. And it was the delegates' decision that with that move on the schedule, even though they're still not registered, that they could be accessed through one of the unapproved drug or device pathways. And it's the authorised prescriber one which gives the highest level of stringency and controls that these drugs ended up in. The general principles for any medical practitioner, I should say for some of them, even health practitioners generally with rights of prescribing are able to access some of these. The general issue is that because the TGA has not evaluated them, it's in the responsibility of the person who's prescribing them to have evaluated them. So the person who's prescribing them needs to have understand the condition that's being treated and the product itself. There's a need for considering risks. There's a need for obtaining informed consent. There's a need for even individual state and territory requirements to be adhered to as well. And also the need for the product to check that the product is available and also affordable. The medical practitioner is also responsible for the use of an unapproved product and all of the outcomes, and that includes adverse reactions. So the sorts of controls and supports and frameworks that sit in place with a normal prescribed drug from Schedule 4 do not exist in unapproved pathways. So let me talk you through the pathways. You essentially go one of two ways. If you want to prescribe to multiple patients, you then need to apply for an authorised prescriber. If you want to prescribe to a single patient, it's what's called a special access scheme. So the authorised prescriber one, but that includes a process that includes the approval of an HREC or a specialist college, is the standard pathway of the authorised prescriber. And this is where the psychedelic drugs currently sit at the moment. And that includes not only an application to an HREC, but following that a TGA approval before approval is made. There's also this other authorised prescriber pathway, which is fairly recent, that was established in 2020, which is a streamlined pathway where there is an established history of use. And there's quite extensive lists that are available on the TGA website to tell you if the drug that you're after is in those. MDMA and psilocybin do not sit on these lists. Some medicinal cannabis products do. But essentially, the step involving an HREC is not involved there, and it's basically a TGA approval and then straight towards authorised prescriber approval. I guess the relative usage of these schemes is listed there for you. It's no secret that medicinal cannabis, there's just been an explosion of the number of authorised prescribers that are able to prescribe medicinal cannabis under these. Sorry, I can't see half my slides. I'm just going to try and get the right. If I press that, then I can see them. There we go. So the standard HREC, as you can see here, the roughly 1,000 or 800 medicines and 300 to 350 devices have been approved under this sort of process. So it's not a new process, and it's certainly been there since the Act was first written about 30 years ago. But the streamlined pathway, I think, is going to be rapidly catching up. And nicotine, and we'll see a little bit more action and some information here with nicotine vaping products, the regulation changing around those in the coming months. Just briefly talking about the special access scheme, there's three major ones. They do all require TG application before you get approval, but it's only to prescribe to a single patient. And SAS-A is for where there's a life-threatening or a critical condition that needs urgent treatment. SAS-C is that similar established history of use, and SAS-B is where a whole bunch of other things sit where the practitioner does need to justify the clinical use. I briefly mentioned the difference between Schedule 8 and Schedule 9. Schedule 9 essentially says there's no currently established therapeutic value. And with the recent publications of the clinical trials in this area, with the advice of a number of different independent publications, the delegate at the time decided that there was some established therapeutic use for these two agents in this specific conditions by specific clinicians, mainly because of the ability to be able to add additional safety steps and regulations around the accessibility. So what were those safety, so those additional regulations, I should say? Well, so it was specifically psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA. But in order to be able to access, you needed to be a registered psychiatrist who'd been awarded a fellowship of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, to obtain approval from an HREC committee and also approval from the TGA. And also noting that possession of these substances without authority would still be illegal. Importantly, these medicines are not going to be available through the Special Access Scheme. For all other indications, they still remain S9, and obviously we still need clinical trials to progress. And also that approval for protocols which enable the patient to take the medicines home was not a possibility. And it was quite clear that with an HREC application, which you can see here, the process whereby the applicant had to demonstrate their training and their experience of not only themselves, but all the other staff that was involved in the treatment. And I guess the difficulty here was that we weren't really, so even though the TGA is able to approve a drug, there's a whole bunch of clinical processes that sit next to it, and the TGA is not able to regulate clinical practice. So the justification for the product, I guess, is reasonably straightforward, and the evidence for its use. But the protocol that the clinician wants to be able to employ was also needed to be provided. And that includes inclusion-exclusion criteria, much as we would see in a clinical trial evaluation, that there would be a protocol that detailed assessment and management of the site at which it was going to be used, the other staff that was going to be involved, and the safeguards that were going to be used to ensure that the treatment didn't cause any harm. Of importance, I think, is that the authorised prescriber is specific to that psychiatrist who holds the approval. It's not intended that one psychiatrist be given approval and then 10 other psychiatrists that work in the practice with that psychiatrist are able to access the drug. It's only that psychiatrist. And it's very clear in the authorised prescriber legislation that there needs to be a therapeutic relationship between the psychiatrist and the patient, and that psychiatrist has to be directly involved in the immediate care of every patient that undergoes treatment. And that includes screening and discussion about consent, sourcing the product, reviewing the patient during the psychotherapy, assessment following the treatment, further follow-up, and also that the psychiatrist had to have relevant experience in the use of the product or demonstrate that they had sufficient supervision. The treatment protocols I alluded to, well, I guess there's a lot of published treatment protocols that are out there for psychiatrists to be able to utilise and present to the ethics committee. There's certainly a number of those studies that are sitting in the independent expert panel report that was commissioned by the TGA in order to help guide this program. Step 2 is to once the HREC approval's been gained, to take it to the TGA for further approval, and all of that is an online process. We're interested in again clinical justification and governance, and the use of measures to protect patients, but also very importantly the informed consent. And I guess that provides a reassurance to everybody, including the patient, exactly what the clinician responsibilities are here, which are the ones that I went over earlier. We would expect, as is the case for every unapproved drug, that all clinically appropriate medicine options that are already registered have been considered before you apply for an unapproved drug. And as I mentioned before, the authorised prescriber is only allowed to supply the product to the specified patients under their immediate care and not to other practitioners. Have I got time to go on, Gordon, or do you need me to stop talking here?
Yeah, just a couple of minutes, Robyn.
Okay, cool. When we talk about obtaining the product, there is still some guidance that's coming together on this, but it's clearly that this is not for mushrooms that you've been growing in your backyard, that this is for pharmaceutical grade psilocybin and MDMA that has a track record, and most of these are still coming from overseas, though I do believe there are some licenses that are about to be granted in Australia for specifically for GMP manufacture, and that compounded products are not allowed under this either. Together with the authorised prescriber approval comes a very clear message that you are not allowed to advertise prescription medicines or unapproved therapeutic goods to the public, and it is illegal for any authorised prescriber or facilities to indicate that they can prescribe or supply MDMA or psilocybin, but you can advertise exclusively to health professionals, provided there are means to prevent access of the advertisement to the public. There can be information provided by a healthcare practitioner to a patient during consultation or treatment, and that's not subject to the advertising rules. But you do have to be careful to present factual, balanced information about MDMA or psilocybin. Unlikely to be, so if you're doing it at conferences, it's unlikely to be considered advertising, but it does depend on the context of the presentation. This is my last slide, which is, oh no, my second last slide. We do need clinical trials to continue, especially for all of the other indications. And some of them are just listed there, and some of the trials that are currently ongoing, including anxiety, substance use disorder, mood and anxiety in advanced cancer. There's been great work coming out of some of the teams at St Vincent's in Melbourne, and obsessive compulsive orders, as well as alcohol use disorder, a number of other psychiatric conditions and neuromuscular disorders. These are all being trialled not just in Australia, but also overseas. So I guess that's the call for action that way. There are a number of resources. I've alluded to a few of them. They're all on that website there, which is the Unapproved Therapeutic Goods website. That website contains also hubs, which there is some more concentrated information, some FAQs, information for consumers, as well as psychiatrists, as well as other practitioners, as well as HRECs. The last word, I guess, is just, if you do have any questions, if there's any other processes, where we're only too happy to sit down and talk through some of the problems with you. That's how you contact us at sas@health.gov.au. And I think that's all I've got. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks, Robyn. A bit of a whirlwind tour of the authorised prescriber. Not really too much time, but here's one from Sonia. So if you want to look at do a clinical trial to look at feasibility, would you use the authorised prescriber or the CTN pathway? Or do authorised prescriber is purely just for the processes of prescribing. And I guess it's understanding that these drugs do have some level of clinical utility, and that for some patients, being able to access drug and not being part of a clinical trial is that next subtle step from 9 to 8. So any clinical trial still belongs in CTN and still involves, obviously, HREC. Yeah, and it does seem a bit, always to me seems a bit odd that you wouldn't use clinical ethics as opposed to human ethics for this, but it's just the way it is. But I think,
And look, it's a really interesting question, Gordon, and something that I do muse on. This has, been sitting, I guess, in the legislation for 30 years. And I suppose that the human ethics predated clinical ethics.
Maybe so.
I know there's, for the larger institutions, most of this would probably go through a clinical ethics with sign off by a human ethics, if you like, just to sort of comply with the legislation. One thing I'm finding, working with the TGA, where there needs to be a change, it's always possible. And, we take our legislation to Parliament 2 or 3 times a year in order to make sure that we're maintaining current and fit for purpose. So, I hear what you're saying. I think that's probably something we can look at. Understanding, of course, that clinical ethics committee sits within hospitals. Not all hospitals have them.
Fair point.
And there's no possibility of registering them as we have within H&MRC.
Yeah. Okay.